our fundamental economic system is designed to tolerate and maybe even encourage bad actors.
Yeah.
If you put AI in that broader context, you're going to think a little differently, and maybe we'll finally have raised the stakes enough that we have to take this seriously. But just think about this. All of our food companies, basically try to make their food addictive, and we have an obesity epidemic. That's, there are bad actors there. This is a regulated market. The scale of harm is quite large.
Yeah.
We're just used to it.
We're worried about machines stamping out humanity when humanity, I think, has a much higher than 10% chance of doing that on its own.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And even if they did it with machines, if these machines make that more possible, okay, well, let's not have AIs involved in launching nuclear weapons. Let's not have AIs involved in maybe
unless it's the button that Putin's got his finger on, then could we have AI?
Yeah, there is that.
All right, welcome back to Invisible Machines. Today, Rob, we're having a heck of a discussion with Tim O'Reilly, who is the founder of O'Reilly Media. He also, as we'll discuss, had pretty much the world's first website.
Yeah, that's crazy, isn't it? The first commercial website that had advertising.
Yeah, that's quite a milestone.
Yeah.
Or a notch. He also, Inc. magazine, I think in 2010, called him the Oracle of Silicon Valley. And I think some of that comes through in our conversation.
I think of how crazy I felt and looked talking about conversational AI, like whatever, 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, like changing everything. Mm-hmm. The glossy-eyed look people would give me, and the, like I'd have to tone it back. I can't imagine what it was for him. Creating the first website. He's probably talking about the internet, like changing everything, and everyone thinking he was crazy. And then, like on one hand, how much has changed, and then on the other hand, how little.
Yeah.
Yeah. These ads on his site that had eyeballs and sponsors that paid him money for the ads. Not sure how different that is today. But this should be interesting. He's at a front row seat to change all the way from the start of the popularization of the internet to Web 2.0, Web 2, I think, which he coined, I believe, if not popularized. The long list of books that O'Reilly's published and etc. Like he's kind of seen a lot.
Well, we didn't even get into it, but I mean, one of those O'Reilly books was yours.
All right.
Effective UI, correct?
Yeah.
Interesting. We forgot to bring that up. Yeah. And towards the end of the talk, it's cool. You prompt him with a question where he sort of tracks his journey from then to now and puts it in perspective as to like how big of a deal is this moment in history of technology.
Yeah. I was pretty excited to hear him kind of regard this as more of an evolution going quickly than and I'm paraphrasing, but an evolution that's going quickly versus a revolution. And I guess the thing that's jarring is the speed in which the evolution is happening, which maybe that's just part of the definition of revolution. But
that idea that we've talked about a bit too, where to most of the world it seems like this conversational AI came out of nowhere, but for people like you who've been working with it for decades, it's like finally
you're watching,
people are seeing what I've been talking about this whole time.
Yeah, it's not that something major just happened, it's that something major just got noticed, but it's been happening slowly, incrementally along the way, and then suddenly the world took note, and that defines the moment. It's the moment the world took note versus the moment it happened.
An important distinction, really.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, cool.
All right,
Let's
let's see what he has to say.
let's jump into this chat with Tim right now. Hey, just a quick note before we jump into this discussion with Tim O'Reilly. Tim was having some internet connectivity issues as we were recording this, so if you notice that, don't worry. The conversation still continues, and let's get to it right now. All right, well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us on Invisible Machines. Rob and I were having this conversation recently. I think a lot of people have been having conversations about regulation with all these explosions in AI technology. But we were trying to come up with, are there things that you can do with AI right now that are damaging and that can cause the kind of damage that might get sorted out in a court of law? Are there things you can do with AI that aren't already illegal in that sense? Like, are there ways you can use it to hurt people that aren't already in some way protected by various laws, nationally and internationally?
The answer is almost certainly. But as there's this great little book by two Nobel Prize-winning economists called "Fishing for Fools," PHISH and PHOOLS, and it basically is about the fact that there is an efficient market for fraud, just like there's an efficient market for everything else. And one of the things that you can say about internet technologies is that they do make markets more efficient. And there are various technologies that put people in charge of efficient markets, such that, Google or Amazon or now OpenAI is in fact the invisible hand of a market. And so in some sense, the issue is less, there's one set of issues, which is how is the technology itself regulating its behavior? Because I think one of the mistakes we make in thinking about regulation is that it's the imposition of rules from without. And that's part of it. But the real regulation, that often runs things is embodied in the thing itself. And you have to build affordances for regulation. Like if you can't track something, you can't really do it. You think about the FAA and some of its things where it's regulating approach patterns to airports or areas that you can't fly over. Well, you have instrumentation that lets you follow those regulations. And so I think in a lot of ways, when we're thinking and talking about regulating AI, we have to think of it of the two sides of the coin. What's the outside framework for thinking about it, and then what's the inside framework for actually doing it? And also, what are the incentives on each side to do the right thing? So when I think about, the analogy that came to me recently when I was writing this piece was the analogy to financial accounting. And we do have a set of rules that businesses use that go back to the 13th century. And it's called double entry accounting. And you it's a way of keeping track of your money, and it's really effective and it's really good. And virtually every business of any size uses it. And then we have a set of accounting regulations that say, if you're a public company, you must use it and you must report on how you're using it. But if you then look at the implementation of those rules, they don't keep up with the evolution of this efficient market for fraud. You kind of go, people can slip through, they can still perform fraud in those contexts. And there's going to be a lot of stuff that will slip through with AI regulation as well. But what we need to start with is we say, okay, well, what are the ways that the people who build these things, what are the tools that they're building for regulating them? And so, the whole training process is a form of regulation. And when you hear people like OpenAI saying, we're, or there've been all these adversarial, red teaming, so to speak, which has gotten breathlessly reported on in the press, and that's the process of working out the problems. It's like just like with a new airplane, you have test pilots who fly them, under punishing conditions, and they try to figure out what could go wrong. And I think we're in that process right now for the current generation of AI. And so part of what I started pushing for was this notion that what we should do is formalize the best practices of the present for managing these things. And that means, how do you detect and weed out bias? How do you detect and weed out attempts to misuse these things? You hear stories. It's like, okay, I'm trying to get it to be racist, or I'm trying to get it to give me bad advice about suicide, or I'm trying to get it to explain to me how to make a bomb or poison gas. And effectively, those are, if you think about back to my airline analogy, these are, like downdrafts, or unruly passengers, or, and so, after 9/11, there was this new set of best practices, which was you make more sturdy cabin doors. The crew is trained to, when the pilots come out, to make it harder to get at the cabin, because they put the little cart across. Those are rules, new affordances against a new kind of attack by a bad actor. And, I think there's a lot of ways to think about this that would make it a lot easier and a little less fraught. Because one of the things that I think is wrong with a lot of regulation, a lot of legislation in general, is that it's so seen as a once and done kind of process. We're going to figure out all the problems. We're going to make a set of rules. And then you go, oops, we need a new rule. So it turns out, for example, that the European Union rules on AI explainability couldn't explain the decisions that were being made by anti-lock brakes. So they had to make a new rule that accepted anti-lock brakes from algorithmic explainability, right? And stuff like that. It's just, and there's this great line from Clay Shirky. It was back when the Affordable Care Act came out and healthcare.gov failed. And he wrote an article, I think it was in Foreign Affairs or maybe Foreign Policy, I forget which one. And he had this fabulous line about the waterfall development process, which my wife Jen Polka in her book kind of is also applied to the policy development process. And it is this idea that the waterfall method, which is where you design the thing from the beginning and you kind of go through this cascading set of steps till you get to the end of the process, which is how government software is built and how basically most policy works, is, as in his words, is a commitment not to learn anything while doing the actual work. And if you think about a lot of the way we're approaching regulation, it's like we're going to make shit up, and then we're not going to learn anything while we're actually trying to.
The assumption of knowing up front everything there is to know.
We're done with regulation. That's right. And so instead, we need a regulatory process. And in my opinion, the first place we are is we start with, what are people actually doing that's working? Is everybody doing it? Because you look around and you kind of see, there's a research paper that was published about GPT-4 and it makes certain disclosures. And then when Facebook released Llama, they had a model card and they showed certain things, the weights, the model, the parameter weights, which nobody else has shown in their disclosures. And you go, well, maybe that's a really good disclosure and everybody ought to do that. So you could look around and go, okay, somebody did this part really well. Somebody else did that part really well. Somebody else has a really good red teaming process, but not everybody does. and you basically assemble just like we have for accounting. What's the base set? And then you put in place a process to keep dynamically updating it. You also figure out what are the standards that you audit against. But you really have to frame it all in the context of incentives.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, you think about financial regulation, we have a set of tools that are really good, but they're complex. And say somebody like Warren Buffett, the master value investor, is somebody who can read company financials and see through to the business and really understand it. Not everybody understands it. But he knows the difference between a well-managed company and a badly managed one. And if, quite honestly, if he were a regulator with his expertise, he would be basically saying, yeah, these guys need to up their game. These guys are squirrely. I wouldn't invest in those guys, And so, we know the difference between a well-managed company and a poorly managed one. And I think we need to get to that same understanding for AI. I'm not saying that would solve all the problems, but it would solve some important problems.
Up something,
and it would give us a base.
You brought up something super interesting to me, which is this idea of, I think it's like, disclosed risk, I guess, is one way to put it. And that's, am I a test pilot testing a experimental aircraft, or am I a passenger on a global airline? It is when I'm using these AI tools, am I a test pilot, and therefore, as long as the risks, I'm aware of the risks, like there's a different standard to any liability associated with a test pilot getting into an aircraft, an experimental aircraft, to like, a commercial passenger that bought a ticket and getting onto an experimental aircraft, right? And that distinction is pretty clear in the world of airplanes, but in the world of software, is it clear that when I'm going and using these tools that it's experimental, and therefore I assume the risks, and that's the idea, or like are we having trouble drawing that line between when is this technology like crossed over from an experimental tool for people to experiment with at their own risk to okay, we're now deploying this and warranting it, etc.
Well, we're right on the cusp of that, and obviously that would be the next level of regulation. Would be not to specify again in detail, you must do this, you must do that. But simply to say, if something blows up, you're liable. And the question, of course, is how far does that liability go? And you think again, we have some interesting examples, with self-driving cars, where the rules say you're supposed to keep your hands on the wheel. You're supposed to be, you can let this, it's just like kind of like an autopilot of sorts, but you're still supposed to be paying attention. And then people start just, taking naps, and there were some, pretty bad accidents. And, I think the thing there was, clearly the people paid a pretty high price for their misuse. And I think we'll, there's sort of a mix. We need to regulate the users in some ways, as well as the just like when we think about driving a car, there is a regulation that says you must be a licensed driver, and you could imagine something that said you must be a licensed user. And that would be, like, it's not to say, like, again, you think about the different ways that this industry could be configured. You can go, okay, we have a set of constrained models and tools, say inside, there's a writing assistant inside a Google Docs or Microsoft Word. There's a a video editing assistant, and you kind of go, okay, there's going to be some parts of that where you go, oh, you don't really need to be licensed to use
Right.
these features. I mean, you're writing stories, whatever. But like if for example, you get up all the way to deepfake technology, you could have imagined a regime where you said, okay, to get an API key or to use this tool, you have to actually be
Mm-hmm.
identified. You have to effectively have a license. And again, this is something that Gillian Hadfield has been pushing, the notion of registration as a kind of
Yeah.
important kind of regulation. Literally, someone like OpenAI, who has a very powerful model, says, okay, we have to be registered, and in order for somebody to use the most advanced features, they have to be registered. I.e., so we know. Now that's sort of already broken down in some sense because of Llama, Alpaca, and so on. The Facebook, as usual, or Meta, I should say, moved fast and
Mm-hmm.
broke things, even though, I mean, in some ways, OpenAI had already done that. But there were a lot of people in the national security field, for example, saying, well, we have this moat in that these things are very large and expensive and very hard to train, and therefore that's a
Yeah.
control point. So this OpenAI is going to have this, and Google's going to have this, and a few other companies in China will have it. But you have that choke point where you can go, okay, OpenAI, you have to tell us who was doing this thing, and you can stop them, you can revoke their access or whatever. But now that we have independent open source models that are proliferating and that are getting better faster than anybody thought. That's the point of that leaked Google memo. We have no moat. The large compute costs on training were not actually as much a moat as everybody thought. That's going to make it harder to do that kind of regulation. But again, it's not. There are ways that you think about this in terms of the flows of information. You can think about, there's so much work being done and to be
Yeah.
done because it is a new
Yeah. The
field.
lines are just so
But I don't
fuzzy.
think the
Like
problems are going to
you
be part
sort
of it.
of you sell a paring knife to somebody and you make it clear it's for slicing vegetables, and they use it as a hammer and they cut themselves, and then then they hold you responsible for selling a dangerous hammer. And you're like, but I never said it was a hammer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the regulation does have to be sensible. There are a lot of tools that can be used dangerously. I mean, the question really is, how bad is
Mhm.
this? And it is a new wave of democratization of enormous
Yeah.
power. And, in the same way that the internet was, but maybe even amplified even further. And, but again, if you think about, for example, AI generated misinformation, right now, that still has to transit over, various kinds of social networks, and those guys then, that's not about regulating OpenAI necessarily, or the ability to generate stuff. It's they might want to really be working with the YouTubes and the Facebooks and whatever. Okay, how are we going to detect fakes that are generated with
Mhm.
our tool? But that's true heck of Photoshop,
Right.
for Christ's sake. So um,
Yeah, it's funny how like with
I
AI
think
in this
we're in
moment, like before, y- you could Photoshop somebody into a photograph that wasn't actually there. I almost like conjure up like Forrest Gump being, those pictures of him with the president, etc.
yeah.
It seemed like we didn't freak out as badly then when that happened, to like now where that's just a lot easier to do. It's not that you couldn't do it if you had the skills. It's
Yeah,
just much easier to do right now. and you can sort of do it on the fly. But somehow, since we've got this label assigned to it, like AI, and we've anthropomorphized this thing, it almost feels like more of higher consequence than actually the first time we digitized an image and photoshopped somebody into a place convincingly that they weren't at.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in some ways, this is happening very quickly, and it's a bit of a surprise. In other ways, it's something that's immensely more powerful than what we had before. But there is also just a lot of fear mongering, and there is a lot of, I think, semi-intentional confusion
definitely
between these fears of remote artificial general intelligence with its own agency. The way people talk about it, the AI did this, the model did this, and you look at the famous New York Times story with Kevin Roose, where it's suggesting the model Bard is not Bard, Sydney was suggesting he leave his wife and you kind of go, he had to torture it to get that output.
He led the witness.
That was not like a model didn't do something. He managed to make it say that, and it's just that. Come on, that's just not. There's just some real.
In a way, it's an example of how stupid it is, because you can lead the witness easily, right?
That's right. Exactly. So that kind of brings me back around to an unfinished thought that I had earlier, which is, all regulation has to be put in the context of incentives, because there are bad actors. There are people who are passively bad actors, who are, i.e., they're profiting from bad actors, and then there are good actors, and good uses. And so when you think about like bad actors, okay, so Facebook wasn't spreading misinformation. People were bad actors were using Facebook to spread misinformation, and Facebook was not doing a good enough job of
negligence
policing that
at best,
because they had their own incentives that said, well, this is engaging content, and I think that is in a lot of ways the biggest threat is that our fundamental economic system is designed to tolerate and maybe even encourage bad actors. If you put AI in that broader context, you're going to think a little differently, and maybe we'll finally have raised the stakes enough that we have to take this seriously. But just think about this. All of our food companies, basically try to make their food addictive, and we have an obesity epidemic. That's, there are bad actors there. This is a regulated market. The scale of harm is quite large. We're just used to it.
Well, it's interesting too, because you're talking about a form of regulation that would kind of need to be flexible and adaptive, which are things that the government is not particularly well known for being. And then you're also coupling that with the set of technologies that's mutating and changing and evolving every day and kind of jutting out in unexpected directions. So does regulation require a bit more than what we're used to? Are we looking at like systemic change that needs to happen before we can really feel like we understand it?
I believe that's what I'm working up to, because I think that there is a systemic change that's necessary. And it is basically wrapped up in this concept, which I actually talked about in my 2017 book, WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. We have already built a rogue AI. It's just a slow AI. That term slow AI comes from Charlie Stross, the science fiction writer, who gave this inspired rant where he said that corporations are just slow AIs. Right? They have their own motives. We've already told them to do the wrong thing. And that's really, if you look at shareholder capitalism as opposed to stakeholder capitalism, it's a classic example of, the thing that is that far future fear of artificial general intelligence, Nick Bostrom's
Yeah.
paperclip maximizer. You gave the AI the wrong instructions, and it went to town and said, "Oh, actually, we can make more
Yeah.
paperclips to get
Yeah.
rid of the
Yeah.
people." And I I go, well, isn't that a description of Purdue
Right.
Pharma? If we soften these regulations, we can sell these more of these opioids. We can make shareholder value. And here's this collateral damage. I don't think they intended to make an opioid crisis, but they certainly are responsible for it because they weakened the regulations. They literally lobbied to make it sound like this stuff was safer. They marketed to physicians to prescribe it. And all of that was because here's this big slow AI called Purdue Pharma that was told optimize for shareholder profit. Don't actually think about all these other things. And I think that, so ultimately, if you think that way, you go, oh, wow, so much that's wrong with our world is already is that we're already in the hands of slow AIs that are being told to do the wrong thing. We're now going to speed up and give more power to that process. And what that says to me is if we really want to fix AI governance, we have to fix corporate governance because corporations are going to be the ones who are
Yeah. I
most.
almost think of it as like slow, but
Yeah.
also like really basic algorithms, like really blunt force, like the first like and newsfeed algorithms of Facebook, just so basic and unsophisticated that it has all this it's like using a rock to pound a nail, like just these really, really lame, simple algorithms, because as humans, we need simple algorithms to execute at scale. So enterprises need these like basic, simple algorithms so that they can get consistency and all of these things. And now we're in the world of more sophisticated algorithms, and maybe it's through it, not around it, or not holding it back. It's that we got to get out of the world of basic blunt force algorithms that we might look back on as like really rudimentary tools, and say, like, once we get more sophisticated algorithms, then this allows us to bob and weave for those edge cases. But I wanted to bring up something you just struck, which is like, that movie Minority, I think it's Minority Report, where they like put people in jail for predicting that they're going to commit a crime. Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think there's an irony here where we're trying to like almost police something before the crime's been committed in AI. Like we're kind of looking at it like this is about to happen, and we're looking at like regulating what hasn't happened yet. It kind of feels a little Minority Report-ish.
We were talking about fraud earlier, and fraud is not legal, but there's like all these like micro offenses now that can be happening at almost this like subatomic level that we now have to figure out how to police.
Yeah. The question is, though, do we want, how much, how much policing do we want? How much do we need? And how much of it can we expect the market to do? How much can we expect individuals to do? But I guess I would just say that the system is imperfect. There are bad actors, including, again, this sort of gray area class of bad actors, of which Facebook or Meta, and YouTube and all the ones from the last generation are probably in the B leagues, quite honestly, compared to tobacco companies, oil companies, Purdue, pharma companies, in terms of, the harms that they have enabled or encouraged. Quite honestly, I just think we're in more of a panic about new technology than and we tolerate everything else. So, this great study by Yochai Benkler wrote a book about internet propaganda, and they studied Twitter, and they noticed that on that basically misinformation and biased stuff started on the fringes of Twitter for small things, and it gets picked up and it gets amplified. And he said, look, on the left, there tends to be, and this was at the time they did the study, it's a little less true now, I think, there tends to be a mainstream media ecosystem that tamps down the most extreme stuff. And on the right, there's a media ecosystem that amplifies the most extreme stuff, the pizza gates and so on. And why is that? Well, because somebody figured out they could make money by doing that. And so I put Fox News in a position of far greater responsibility for the misinformation that was supposedly spread by Facebook, because they were the ones who basically then hijacked the system and said, well, we're mainstream. They lobbied also against social media regulation, saying you're biased against us because you're filtering out this misinformation that, is very profitable for us. So again, you really just have to look at who the bad actors are and what their incentives are. And we need a much broader view of who we need to regulate. It's not just OpenAI we need to regulate. It's going to be, it's going to be Fox News. It's going to be the people who go, oh yeah, God, this deep fake technology is the best thing ever. We can make amazing news. And I do think that we're anyway,
it's those people who promise it's going to be safe when it's not. Not the folks who are saying it's not safe, and use at your own risk. It's those downstream who are purporting to sell it as something safe, and then it's not, which is that's clearly a lie. Or something I wanted to.
Yeah, that's really not what I'm saying. I'm actually saying that there are people who are saying, yeah, this is a dangerous technology. Use it with care. And then there's going to be a set of people who are outright bad actors who are saying, I actually want to create and spread, misinformation.
Got it.
And then there's going to be a set of people who are enablers of that for profit. And I think that we just have to recognize that the chain of bad actors. And it's kind of an ironic piece in this whole AI regulation story, because some of the people who are making the biggest stink about AI regulation are demonstrating themselves to me as purveyors of misinformation. And I'm talking about the people who wrote, you probably read about this highly reported study that at least half of AI researchers think that there's at least a 10% chance that these things could destroy humanity. And if you actually go read the survey that they did, it asks a bunch of open-ended questions. Like, when do you think we might achieve artificial general intelligence? I think the consensus answer was 2059. They asked, this is a bunch of questions about AI, and then they came to AI safety, and they introduced the section in a way that they don't introduce any of the other sections, with a 2-paragraph introduction with a quote from Stuart Russell, who's a great guy, but they took it, this piece where he was just saying, here are all the possible ways that AI could go terribly wrong. And then they say, how worried are you about this? That's called anchoring bias. That is a completely biased survey. It is a piece of misinformation that was designed to create that statistic. And then it gets widely, fed into the media. So I guess, here are these people who are positioning themselves as the champions of, regulating the risks of AI. And they're not, here they are using a much simpler, older technology to create massive misinformation that's really shaping
it's like
the dialogue.
Humans doing it, which is funny because we're worried about machines stamping out humanity, when humanity, I think, has a much higher than 10% chance of doing that on its own.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And even if they did it with machines, if these machines make that more possible, it will still be humans doing it.
I keep hearing this, like, greater than zero chance is enough to talk about, but I feel like a greater than zero chance of hurting humanity as a whole. There's like a whole long list of things that fall into that category of just greater than zero.
Yeah.
And like, why is
Yeah.
this
And
one?
I guess the question is, yeah, uh, there probably are some things that you would say, like again, people talk about the Conference on Regulation of Biotechnology, Asilomar, where they decided to pull back from certain kinds of things. And I think there probably are things that are in
Mhm.
that category, and some of it might be, okay, well, let's not have AIs involved in launching nuclear weapons. Let's not have AIs involved in
unless
maybe,
unless it's the button that
other forms
Putin's
of.
got his finger on, then could we have AI?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is that. Um, but there definitely are things where you go, yeah, that might not be a good
Yeah,
idea. Let's not have autonomous killer
right,
robots.
Are we
right.
in like a weird double bind right now too, though? Because there are companies, big organizations, enterprises trying to figure out how to adopt all the technologies surrounding AI, but they're doing it from a mindset of like profitability first. Like we need some of these big companies to shift their end goal, right? Like they shouldn't be about profitability. Maybe they should be more about like something closer to what Patagonia is doing almost even. So, but at the same time, like they're
Yeah,
having to spend this
I would
money, right?
agree.
They're like needing to make an
Yeah.
investment in making their company less valuable in a way, if they're to follow the trajectory that seems the most responsible anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think though that that's an either
Okay.
or choice. This is, um, there are some very, very, very successful companies that have basically followed, triple bottom line kinds of thinking. And for that matter, Google itself was incredibly profitable from the beginning. I have a general theory of what goes wrong there, though. And it really goes back to why our financial markets are really the evil AI that's
Mhm.
ruling our society. You look at a company like Google, they start out with a motto that says, don't be evil. And there's this new market and it's greenfield and there's this huge opportunity and they're inventing the future and they become an incredibly profitable company. But after 15 years or so, guess what? Internet penetration is kind of everywhere. And what do? They go, we have to keep growing. Why do they have to keep growing? Why do they have to keep increasing, become ever more profitable? Because that's what the master
Yeah, it's
algorithm
the feedback
says.
loop. It's a
We built
big
a machine
enterprise.
where you pay your people in stock. Your stock price has to
Yeah,
keep going up, and so you start with good intentions, and then you start preying on society a little bit, just around the edges, and eventually you go in whole hog because you are a
yeah,
slave to that
yeah. You
master
could almost
algorithm.
say that the stock market is the AI, and the feedback loop is the stock price, and the company's going to do whatever it takes to move the stock price up, and so long as it's within the boundaries.
That's right.
And it is kind of a dumb machine. It's not very intelligent. It's just doing whatever is within the boundaries of the law, and not because it's within the boundaries of the law, but because that if it goes outside the boundaries of the law, the stock price goes down. So it's just like really this basic machine that's just operating on a one-dimensional feedback loop that isn't necessarily like what's great for society or employees or customers, but just what's great
That's right.
for the stock price. And not even that's what's on their head. That's just the
Yeah,
feedback loop. That's what they get back, and then they adjust, and then they listen.
that's right.
And yeah, it's
Yeah. So I guess I have two. On the one hand, I think whenever there's a new technology, it's a fresh opportunity to look at these fundamental issues of what do we
yeah,
want, who do we want to become, what future do we want to make, and also to look at. I mean, they're just it's just low hanging fruit right now. Like bias in algorithms. and you look at application by application in hiring. How do you deal with that? In media, how do you deal with that? There's questions of copyright and incentives for creators, and how do you deal with that? So there's all these issues that are going to get surfaced and dealt with, and we're going to try to come to sort of agreement about as a
I like that
society.
idea that we're like stepping outside the box for a second, looking inside the box and reevaluating. It's like an opportunity to step outside and evaluate everything, whether it's relevant or not to AI.
Yeah, I think when we do that, we have to actually have our heads on straight, because it's really easy to convince ourselves that it's the technology that's the
Right.
problem. So you think about, there's been a bunch of stuff about algorithmic bias in, say, sentencing, and they go, okay, well, we have to root that bias out of the algorithm. And yes, we do, but we also have to understand that the algorithm and the training is a mirror. It shows us who we have actually been. And so do we actually just say, oh, over there, fix the AI, or do we say, well, shit, which judges did we train this stuff on? Like, what decisions were they making? I mean, if this was decisions from 30 years ago, fine. But if there's still a bunch of recent decisions, and we're seeing that bias, in that training set, we should damn well be reading back to, well, where did it come from?
Right.
Let's fix it. Like, don't just say, oh yeah, we're going to kind of, it's a little bit like you walk in, you look in the mirror, you say, these clothes don't look good on me. And then you try to adjust the mirror so that they look good. But they still don't look good when you go in the world. And there's a lot of things that AI shows us and go,
so you
yeah,
don't
that's
recommend
not a
that?
good
I
look
shouldn't
on
do
us
that, damn
as
it.
a species.
Okay. It's just
Yeah, like, that's not a good look on us as a species. Let's go. Do we just try to fix the mirror, or do we go actually try to look a little better?
Yeah, and
And
which
be a
side of
little
that is
better.
like training large language models? I mean, they in some ways they're a reflection of all the good and bad things we've been pouring onto the web for years and years. So are we training? We're kind of like, are we trying to fix the
Yeah,
mirror, or are we trying to change ourselves?
Yeah.
that's right. And the other thing, of course, is the way that we're dealing with this at O'Reilly. We have a large body of technical content, and we're training a smaller model on our stuff, and so we basically get the benefit of a large language model kind of intelligence and interface, but it's, instead of getting random stuff off the internet and mixing it in with high quality vetted content, we're kind of saying, well, let's take a smaller model and just fine tune it with our content. And you're going to look at that. You think about somebody like Westlaw, as they deploy, or LexisNexis, when they deploy AI, they're going to be basically training a model on legal precedents. They're not going to be training it on what a bunch of people on Reddit think about the law, right? And in some ways, in that case, you may be better off starting with a smaller model, so you're not taking a bigger model that has been trained on all the Reddit stuff. But there's also, even in the training, I think there's something that doesn't get talked about enough, which is you're basically training both a recognizer and an expressor, or an output AI, right? There's one that, and so you might well want to have your input side trained on Reddit, but your output side trained on LexisNexis, so that you can understand when somebody's asking a question in the common parlance, or I read on the internet that blah 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 blah, and so it understands the question, but it also understands that that's not the set of data that you use for the answer. And I think we're going to get better at those kinds of things, where we understand that it's a multi-stage process, and there's different benefits to training part of it on all the bad stuff, but then you basically, I mean, it's just like kids, they learn slang, and they learn so-called bad language, and they also learn, oh, you don't use it, or here's where it's okay to use it, and here's where it's not. And I think there's a lot of stuff that we're going to be
Yeah.
working out.
Yeah. Before we lose you, I don't want to. There's one thing I wanted to ask you or get your perspective on. So I was listening to a podcast with Marshall McLuhan's son, and he was talking about his dad's books, and he made a point that Random, I think it wasn't Random House, it was McGraw-Hill, when they originally published, I don't remember what, Media is the Mess. I'm not sure which book it was, but there was kind of a rule that he mentioned, which was that the book should be, no more than 10% new ideas and then 90% kind of regurgitating old ideas. Because anytime you like get beyond that 10%, you lose people. And sure enough, like for his book, it was well beyond 10%. And it played out exactly as they said. It, tons of criticism and, but they liked it and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it kind of like, it kind of reveals possibly a bigger kind of algorithm in humanity, which is like, we don't want 0% change. Like that feels like stagnation and we get uncomfortable with that, but we don't want, more than 10% change or some number, and then now we're like,
right.
we're beyond that sweet spot. And so naturally we're like, in that criticism mode of, hey, this is bigger than 10% change. This is like 30 or 40% change. And we don't know how to handle that. We don't know what to do about that. And the thought was that this rule that they had created, which I think revolved around academia and textbooks and stuff, seemed like a good petri dish for like testing what is the percentage of change that people are comfortable with. Like, where does that range? And then what happens when you go outside it? No particular question there, other than just you're a publisher. There's probably something about that resonates.
Yeah, I guess I would say that there's a great quote from Alvin Toffler, and he said, "The future always comes too fast and in the wrong order." And I like that because it's not the first time that we'll have confronted issues like this. But there's a real, I think the thing I come back to, and it's really the ultimate point of my book, which was about these issues. The subtitle was, the title was WTF,
Yeah.
What's the
Love
Future
that.
and Why It's Up to Us. And the idea that we have choices to make, and that as a society we do make choices. We design things. It's like our society is a defined artifact. And this is I don't know if you've ever read David Graeber, but his books like the Utopia of Rules and the last book he wrote before he died, The Dawn of Everything. It's just really, it's an exploration of this idea that we have of progress, and that somehow our current society is this inevitable, consequence of a series of evolutionary steps. And it's just like, that's just not true. That you look, for example, because there's a narrative about early agricultural societies, and as they started to store grain, they became complex enough they needed to have an administrative state, and that led to the rise of hierarchy. And it's like, no, actually, you can kind of see there were actually, for tens of thousands of years, there were quite large cities where all the buildings were the same size, no sign of hierarchy. So the two things are, and there's even cases where there was clearly some kind of hierarchy, and then people moved away from it. You kind of talked about in North America, they had this civilization called Cahokia, is what they call it now. But these giant temples, and this is down in Mississippi and Louisiana, And if you look back at the kind of the actual narratives that come from the later Native Americans, there was eventually a revolt against that, and they decided to not to choose
Right.
that life. It wasn't just this sort of collapse of a civilization. At least in
Yeah.
his version, there's this sort of self-serving narrative, which is, the people who are in power are there because it's sort of just an inevitable and necessary point. And he's like, no, societies
Yeah.
make choices,
Yeah, I could like the
and
penthouse of
we
a
can make
big
different
building being
choices.
the headquarters of a company, and now today you know, it's that's almost like a cliche that nobody wants to to be part of. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that slow AI concept, and it kind of reminds me of this idea that Rob and I have talked about before, where it really feels like there would be value to companies having a really good science fiction author, at least on retainer, if not like maybe stationed in the C-suite, just up there to like, because it feels like there aren't enough people that are patient enough. I think you need a lot of patience to build that kind of foresight, and you have to have the right kind of mind. And I mean, that slow AI thing just kind of exemplifies that for me, where you're really seeing all the pieces and kind of
Yeah.
something's emerging that you can then share forcefully.
Mhm.
Yeah, I get that. I don't think that's the answer. Somebody once said, should there be a chief, should companies have a chief ethics officer? And I'm like, dude, there's already a title, CEO, which should be the chief ethics
Yeah.
officer. Back if the company itself doesn't you know have those values, it's you're not going to have anybody who's sort of posted there as the
Yeah.
you know um, kind of the
Yeah. You could
restraining
almost argue
hand.
that once you have
And
one,
and I think
it almost it almost causes people to defer. Like, oh, I don't need to worry about ethics. We have an ethics officer, so I can just, not care about it.
I guess all I'm saying is this is the latest incarnation of a long
Yeah.
struggle. And if we put it in that historical context, we understand both what the stakes are, and we're
Yeah.
not going to
Well,
panic.
you've seen this close up
It
now,
doesn't
like,
help us.
first page on the internet, I think I
Yeah,
read. I mean, you've seen this close up
yeah.
now, and like in the arena from the beginning. How different is this than, the internet? um, and like, how different does this feel?
It's hard to say. In one sense, uh, when I think about this, I think about two or three different uh, ways that it's impactful. And one of them, and I guess partly I'm going to put this in the context of not of the impact on society, but in the impact on the computer industry. And you look at the kind of uh, the rise of the cycles of the computer industry are almost like the rise and fall of civilizations. It's just I sometimes say tech industries. The tech industry is the fruit fly of economics, because you see nations rise and fall over the span of decades instead of centuries. um, um, but but in that cycle, you see the first computers were literally hardwired circuits, and then they were digital general purpose computers, but they were programmed with literally putting in binary digits. And then we got assembly language, and then we got higher level languages. And we're at this sort of command line computer world when most of us first encountered computers. We had our and so you can see this gradual progression to making things easier. And then we get to the web, and there was something really interesting about the web in that it for the first time, it meant that your dominant interface was really heavily in human language. Like if you look at a program like Microsoft Word, even the GUI was just, it was a layer over the command line, but it wasn't, it was little bits of human language embedded in a lot of computer code. And then suddenly the web was the next step, where it was little bits of computer code callable from a human document. So you have these web interfaces, and a button is just just word. And now this is the next stage in that evolution. Now you're just talking to an AI, and it's generating the computer stuff on down the chain all the way back down to the hardware. And so that's an evolution of the communication modality with computers. And if you look at that, this is like one of the really big evolutions. It's like the evolution from the command line to the GUI to the web, and so this would be the fourth in our lifetime, right? Because mobile was sort of like a continuation of web-like interfaces. It wasn't, maybe it's a half step in a certain way. So in that evolution, this is huge. And in each of those evolutions, you got a new set of companies that ruled the roost. And you saw new sources, new control points. A lot of my original thinking about Web 2.0 was driven by that analogy. IBM controlled the computer industry by means of a hardware monopoly. And then when the hardware was commoditized with the personal computer, they still believed, as did everybody else, that it was still a game where you had control via your hardware platform. But Microsoft understood that there was a software game, and they ended up, kind of stealing a march on IBM and coming to rule the roost through software APIs and operating systems. And then along comes the web, and Netscape is playing the old game. They're kind of like, we're going to have an interface. We'll be they used to call it the web top, They didn't realize, but the next generation was actually information interfaces, and it was not software control over software APIs that was the control point. It was data, and that was the essence of my big Web 2.0 thing. And in one sense, you can say that these are just the next generation of data-driven machines, and not really a full step. But I suspect that there's a paradigm shift hidden in there. I wrote this piece called the Open Source Paradigm Shift, which is about that. This the commodification of software by open source led to the re-centralization of power through AI. Through big data. I do think that there is potentially in the AI moment a game changer for people like Google in these smaller models that are distributed open source. They're the equivalent of the personal computer for AI. And so basically, you were seeing more and more big centralized companies like Google and Meta and Amazon, and now suddenly computing power is being democratized again in a pretty profound way. And new companies going to emerge in that transition. So that's one, kind of way of looking at this, is just like the interface. And we have this new, kind of speech as a first-class interface, even to things like programming, but certainly things like art that you couldn't, like, my gosh, you can actually just do art by talking to a computer now. And you can do pretty good, things that you could never do yourself, even more so than in the era of GUI applications. But then there's this other axis which you can look at as, well, what's the scope of, what's the possibility of reach? And, it's really interesting because, we saw that with the personal computer. There were a lot more of them. And then, computers running the web, it was more of them. And then mobile was this huge explosion. And of course, we have also all of these, intelligent devices. I think that that's kind of where we're going to see this other explosion. It's just what's the reach, and it's not necessary because the internet's already global. I'm not sure that it's going to be um, necessarily more more screens. It's going to be more devices, like your cars, your phones, your house. Everything becomes attached to the internet. And so um, and again, in that change in reach, there's going to be new opportunities for companies to become meaningful players and market leaders. And then um, in that, there's also a real risk that I don't think gets talked about very much. And I was on a call yesterday with a bunch of scientists and researchers. We were talking about AI risks, and Sir Martin Rees, who's an astrophysicist, made a really uh, important point. He said the biggest risk that I see that's a real risk is that we become too dependent
Yeah,
on
that's
these
where I'm at.
machines. We're already well down the path where you imagine what could utterly destroy our society. It could be a solar storm,
right, right.
a uh,
Meteor, yeah,
a terrorist attack takes out, but no, things that basically take out our electronic infrastructure, and suddenly we can't feed
yeah,
people, we can't get power to people. People are freezing, people are starving. There's a civilization ending event in our
yeah,
dependence. And so there's a really interesting, again, a set of architectural uh, you know opportunities for society. Now, some of them, like a massive solar storm or something that wipes out electronics, it doesn't help you to have a decentralized power grid, for example. But I think there are certainly a lot of things where decentralized computing, decentralized power grids, decentralized everything is more robust than big centralized systems. But you're going to need a mix. But that machine stops kind of, it's the famous story about E.M. Forster, you know, uh, where people are pampered and
yeah.
they're just used to these, machines doing everything for them, and then
Stop.
suddenly the machine stops and nobody can do
Like
anything
parents and
anymore.
children, like,
It is probably a bigger risk than many of the things that people are getting
yeah, I
worried
think
about
I'm in
right
that
now.
camp. I like, I think there's always like glimmers of the future in today, and one of those to me is the GPS. It's very conversational. It's, you know, it routes a path from point A to point B, but if you like decide to turn left instead of right, it recalculates um and like lets you're still in charge, but it does kind of guide you and help you. And now a soccer mom can become a taxi driver where they don't have to memorize the streets, and that's pretty cool. But
That's right.
I've told this before. If I'm in the midst of a journey and my GPS dies halfway, I'm I'm lost, like more lost than usual, because I have no idea how I got there, and I have no idea where I'm going, and then I just try to do that on scale, like I'm trying to get to, like, so now I have all of these AI systems that are like GPSing me through life, and I'm just depending on them to tell me when to get up, when to go to bed, what to eat. And then, like you said, the power grid goes out and I'm like lost. I don't know how I got there, and I don't
That's
know
right.
where I was going.
Well, and the conversational interface kind of like leads you there
Yeah.
too, right? Like if you think
Yeah,
of something like ChatGPT as a front end needing a back end, like once it's
yeah.
part of an
Very parental.
ecosystem, yeah, where it can,
It's how parents like guide you, like through words.
but like
Yeah,
once it has context and connect to the other
Yeah.
software in your life, I think the world becomes a little more like Rob and I talked about the movie Her a lot, where he has this OS in his life, and it often manifests on his phone or like whatever this thing he's carrying, but he has an earbud. It's sort of like this silent passenger that he can just talk to, and it can do any number of things. It can show him things on
Yeah.
different screens. But then, you live like that for 5 years. What happens when that disappears? Like, can you remember how to get to the bathroom? Like,
Yeah. Well, I think again, our society is not everybody's in the
hmm
same boat. And we'll have different societal segments that are more or less into various bits of technology. So again, I'm not. I'm a lot more worried about the motivations of many of the actors and the incentives that our society provides to many of the actors than I am about the technology itself.
It's a very human problem.
And that's right. It's a very human problem. I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap. Very human.
All right. Problem. Well, Tim, thank you for helping us unravel
great.
this very human problem. It was a lot of fun. And we'll look forward to maybe continuing the conversation some other time. All right. Thanks again for joining us on another episode of Invisible Machines. Be sure to subscribe to UX Magazine wherever you get your podcasts so you can hear new episodes as they are released. You should also subscribe and like the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. Big thank you to everyone at UX Magazine for your support in making this podcast, especially our producer, Kate Timchenko, who has done an amazing job booking some fantastic guests. Thank you also to our executive producer, Elias Parker, who has also done a lot of work booking some pretty incredible guests for this show. And thank you, as always, to the OneReach.ai marketing team and our video editor, Mike Litvinov, for making this podcast look and sound wonderful. We will see you again next week right here on Invisible Machines.